안녕하십니까. 자유기업원 아주 귀한 손님이 오셨습니다. 요크 박사님이신데요. 퍼시픽포럼 실장님이세요. 이 퍼시픽포럼은 이 태평양 아시아 지역의 안보라든가 경제 또 자유주의에 관한 연구를 하는 그런 싱크탱크입니다. 자유기업원은 지난 28년 동안 아틀라스와 함께 전 세계 경제자유 네트워크 속에서 같이 많은 단체들과 협업을 하고 있는데요. 이번에 퍼시픽포럼에 지역연구실장인 요크 박사가 오셔서 함께 이 새로운 한미관계의 방향에 대해서 논의하는 좋은 시간을 갖게 되었습니다. 사실 트럼프 대통령은 많은 것을 바꾸어 놓으려고 하고 있습니다. 특히 자유주의에 관한 부분에서도 밀접하게 관계된 부분, 특히 관세 문제라든가 이 대중국 관계에 관련된 국제 정세 문제, 이런 다양한 분야에서 변화가 예상이 되고 있는데요. 우리가 자유주의를 지키면서도 또 아시아 지역에서의 번영과 자유가 함께 성장할 수 있는 그러한 좋은 정책이 무엇일까 함께 고민해보는 그런 귀한 시간이 될 것 같습니다. 오늘 요크 박사님의 귀한 스피치 그리고 또 많은 분들의 질문과 거기에 대한 답변 기대하겠습니다.
I said when I came here today I would talk about the U.S.-Korea relationship under the new Trump administration, and that is something I do want to cover, something that we certainly can cover in the question and answer portion of the program, in addition to things that I would like to talk about. And one of the things that I really want to talk about before we get into more focused questions about what Trump is going to mean for the U.S.-Korea alliance that has stood so firm for the last 70 years is kind of what those of us who really identify with the values of classical liberalism can make of the changing world environment that we currently find ourselves in. Because it is a world where a lot of ideas that I think many of us thought had died, had really passed, have returned. And one of the most common slogans and catchphrases of the current administration is America First. But Donald Trump did not invent America First. It is not a new idea. It is actually a relatively old idea dating all the way back to the 1930s. That was a period of time when America was, again, questioning its role in the world and how prominent of a role it should take in other countries' affairs. There was an actual America First committee back then, and that idea has been in circulation really ever since, although largely pushed to the back, where people were saying America should enjoy its role in the world and should make the most of it, try to do the most good that it possibly can. But there were others saying we need to focus on our own affairs. And this has returned with populism. Populism has risen in the last 10 years. It has come back to American politics and has really taken over and spread. It's very popular in other countries too, whether you go to India, the Philippines. Populism is very much present in lots of these countries. And the idea of protectionism, that free trade is not an unmitigated good. It is not always good for countries. That has returned as well. And we have seen with these ideas, with the end of the old ideas about free trade and about free markets coming to an end, we've also seen the end of the so-called unipolar moment, where America was the lone superpower in the world. That has come to an end and led to a lot of additional questions, such as, what do we do in a world environment where nuclear non-proliferation has failed, where countries are continuing to build up nuclear arsenals, whether it's North Korea, but also China. China is also expanding its nuclear arsenal at a rapid rate, and this has left many countries, including this one, to wonder if it should also do the same. So, in addition to that, as ideas about how to solve economic problems become more complicated, we've seen the return of collectivist solutions, whether it's from Bernie Sanders or E.J. Young. And even ideas like religion. The religion should have a role in ordering public life is increasingly becoming popular in some circles, especially in the United States and a few other places. So, However, there are new troubles that are distinct to this moment that don't really have parallels to American history or the history of other places, and that includes the ability of technology to surveil people wherever they are, for people to have their data collected and used, perhaps for nefarious purposes. All of these things are new. News now spreads more quickly than ever thanks to social media. But thanks to social media, thanks to the distrust in traditional news outlets, there is increasingly a question of what actually constitutes news. Is the news you find on social media actually beneficial? Does it provide useful information? We've also seen the rise in this climate of international institutions, the UN and its associated institutions, from the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. But can those institutions be corrupted? In many cases, many people believe that they have. So, in this time, I think it is safe to say that the ideas most commonly associated with classical liberalism, such as pluralism, the idea that many people of different races, backgrounds, beliefs, religions, and so on can come together and form a functional society, okay, and openness to trade, to migration, and also the ideas of cooperation, especially at the international level. All of these things are now under attack. They have faced a more sustained attack, I'd say, than at any point since the end of the Cold War. What does this mean for classical liberals in the US, Korea, or elsewhere? Well, in the United States, thanks to the decline of trust in old institutions and skepticism over foreign aid, we are seeing changes in how the United States relates to the rest of the world. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the cuts to U.S. aid. Okay. On my travels, I have been abroad for about 6 weeks now, traveling to India, Taiwan, the Philippines, and now here. I have encountered many institutions that have very different opinions about U.S. aid. Some are glad to see it gone because they are skeptical about what it was doing in their country. Other places have relied on it and are not sure what they're going to do next. Whatever one thinks of U.S. aid, I think it is safe to say that the United States is about to embark on an experiment, and that is whether or not, okay, forces other than the US government, forces perhaps in the private sector, are going to be able to provide the public goods that US aid once did. And perhaps they can. Perhaps there will be an opportunity. But the adjustment process is likely to be tough. And there is a risk of actors, individuals, and institutions perhaps filling that void and using it for their own ends. I think it's also safe to say that this US government also wants to see a return to how things used to be before World War II. They want to rely on tariffs to fund the government rather than taxes. They also don't want the United States to be in a position where it is responsible for so much of the world's security. Those are all things that it wants to return to. But the problem with that idea is we don't live in the pre-World War II era. We don't live in the pre-World War II world. We live in a world where there are other people to consider, and that includes the People's Republic of China and its leadership. Now, Deng Xiaoping, starting from his reforms in the late 1970s, many people held him up as an example of what the markets could do for a country. Thanks to poverty reduction, thanks to the embrace of innovation, it was believed that China had shown the superiority of capitalism, the superiority of the market system. And China went on to become a country that would embrace global institutions and try to position itself as a global power in that regard. And for many years, we held it up as an example of what benefit those institutions, those ideas could bring. However, one thing that many of us had not considered during that time is that while they had embraced capitalism per se, they were still Marxist-Leninist at heart. And under the leadership of Xi Jinping, we have seen what that means. We have seen that their embrace of internationalism was really for their own ends. and they were really trying to accomplish tasks. They were really trying to accomplish goals that the Communist Party of China has had all along, including returning China to the position of the power in Asia. So, what does that mean for Korea? Korea, under Park Chung-hee, helped write the blueprint for China's explosive growth, I would say. Their ability to rely on exports, the labor costs being lower here allowed them to export more freely. This was a system that allowed them to export cheaply and at high volumes, and this allowed, thanks to that and thanks to investments in industry, to grow at an explosive rate. Something that Chinese don't like to admit, but Deng Xiaoping borrowed that model from them and from Taiwan and from other places. It is one of the great stories of the post-war era. And if anybody has seen that famous photo of North Korea and South Korea at night, yeah, it looks like openness works, clearly. However, this rapid growth period has left Korea with long-term difficulties, long-term challenges that have to be addressed, and that includes the collapse of the birth rate and what that will mean for South Korea's economy, South Korea's security, and so on. And thanks to the explosive growth rate that has not been replicated under the democratic governance, that has led to questions about whether or not authoritarianism is better. That is something that is occasionally revisited. It creates nostalgia for that period of time and frustration. So there's also the possibility in the current climate in Washington that there will be a U.S. retreat from its alliances. There will be a U.S. reconsidering of its alliances. What will that mean for middle powers, such as South Korea? Will we see a return to the relevance of the Melian dialogue, or will we see a return to Lee Seung-man's preferred expression of what great power means? Melian dialogue, of course, refers to this idea that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Syngman Rhee's preferred expression, which I'm sure many of you have heard, gore saomeon seudung tojinda. A shrimp's back is broken when whales fight. South Korea is by no means a shrimp. It is more of a dolkore. So, middle power. But it still has to take under consideration the great powers, their struggle, and what that means for them. What do they have to do for their own security? So, the new era of global relations, because of changes in the US, because of changes in China and elsewhere, it is not all bad. We have seen a new realistic appraisal of great powers. The liberalization period, the end of previous regimes, I guess you could say, in China and in Russia did not in the long term turn them into better places to live for the people there, and it did not turn them into friendlier powers either. Then the United States, thanks to its own declining birth rate, and as well as the sentiments of its people, could not have borne the burden and the responsibility of international security forever. So there has to be a time where new considerations have to be made. So there is also a new need under this time period, under this period that we live in, to explore the meanings of community and what it means for people who value individual freedom. I don't think Friedrich Hayek, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, or any of the other people that we admire would have ever said community and the individual are in opposition. They simply said the individual cannot be crushed by community. So what does that mean? Those are things that we all have to think about. Another thing that this new era has proven, which may prove to be beneficial in the long term, Russia and its failures in Ukraine, China and its current economic problems, its slowdowns, its real estate scandal, and so on, these prove that, well, authoritarians don't have all the answers. Okay? They are not necessarily superior to free societies, to individuals. And many who have seen what happens in those countries are the people who appreciate freedom the most. Just ask any Hong Konger who has had to escape in the last few years, or any Chinese dissident, any Uyghur Muslim who's had to escape from that situation. They have a great appreciation for liberal democratic societies that I think people who are born there might not appreciate. So, we must accept that change has come. We are going to have to continue to defend our ideas, whether they are about free trade, whether they are about regulation. We cannot simply accept that those things are widely popular. Some ideas probably should evolve. Milton Friedman has a quote about poverty that I think is very good and that I think all of us should consider. He has another quote about corporate social responsibility that I think, however, must be reconsidered. His quote about poverty, no democratic society is going to tolerate people starving to death if there is food to feed them. He wrote this at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1947 when others at the society were debating his proposal for a negative income tax. So basically, people who fell below a certain threshold of income would get payments automatically. He said this is the best way to address that. He was opposed quite strenuously by other classical liberals, but he said, it's a fact, we have to do this, or it will be addressed by people who may not have solutions as beneficial as what we have in mind. Other things that he said along the way. His famous corporate responsibility piece from the early 1970s said that there is only one social responsibility of business, and that is to increase its profits without resorting to deception or fraud. What he was arguing against was the idea that corporations should form a position and they should basically be involved in social causes. His argument was they actually can't do that because that's not technically their money. Okay, it's shareholders' money. Their responsibility is to make the shareholders more money. However, in a current age where we have adversarial powers who are happy to make deals with multilateral corporations to increase their profits, okay, but while expanding their influence and reach over free societies, that is something that probably needs to be revisited. Okay, is it actually beneficial for a corporation to cut a deal with the People's Republic of China to increase its profits if it gives China the ability to coerce free societies? I'm not saying I have the answers, but it is something we should think about. In conclusion, classical liberalism should remember its 18th and 19th century roots when it was against hereditary privilege. It was against royalty inheriting its privilege. It was against noble classes inheriting their privilege, and trying to return the focus to individual potential, regardless of where they came from. It should continue to fight against hereditary privilege, the concentration of power, whether it's in bureaucracies or whether it's in individual presidents. And it should fight against the urge for seclusion, the urge to keep out foreign trade, foreign goods, and foreign people. Some of the best results come from intermingling, whether it is in products, whether it is in goods, whether it is in ideas, or whether it is in people, like my son with my wife who I met in Xinjiang. In trade, supply chains, and so on, intermingling produces some of the best results. Those are the things that we should fight for. And we need to be aware of our tradition, the good things that Milton Friedman said, and maybe the more contestable things Milton Friedman said without being tied to that tradition. And we should be willing to fight for openness. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. My co-author, Alex, can also answer questions about the Trump administration from a British perspective. Thank you. There was a lot of faith, I think, when China was a rising power, that over time it would encounter the ideas of freedom. It would encounter the ideas of liberalism, liberalization, and that this would ultimately cause it to change. And I think because we saw what happened in South Korea, And because we saw what happened in Taiwan, those were places that rose up under military-led governments, and over time they changed. And so there was an assumption that China would take the same model, especially if, as their own economies began to slow down, they would have to open themselves up to new ideas. However, those countries, Korea under Park and Chun, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, and so on, those places were not led by communist parties. They were not led by people that were ideologically driven to attain the kind of goals that the CCP has. The Chinese are also a great power and a civilizational power in and of themselves. So the faith that they would change on their own was misplaced, and there were certain conditions and there were certain favors, I would say, given to them along the way that were misplaced, and one of them was World Trade Organization membership. Those were all things that were given to them that really boosted their capabilities without asking for fundamental changes in their governance structures along the way. So those are all things that have to be considered. And so over-reliance on Chinese products, over-reliance on Chinese goods has put many countries in a very vulnerable position. And Korea found that out after THAAD deployment. The United States has found that out many times. Australia did in 2020. Many other countries have found that out along the way. So there needs to be now a exploration of other options. There are other ways of getting the critical minerals, for instance, that we need that China can provide. There are other ways of, I would say, over the long term, okay, pharmaceuticals, there are opportunities and alternatives that can be considered. There's just a lot of different things we need to think about. China has a right to do business in the global market, but countries have to be strategic about what kind of reliances they are building up over time and how those can potentially be used against us. I would say within the present environment, I would say in Korea, there are things that have to be, I would say, reevaluated in terms of a foreign, taking on foreign talent. They need to begin to explore new opportunities. I think the main challenge for Korea in the coming years really will be its birth rate. So there needs to be an exploration of that, and particularly, I think, what that means, Koreanness, 민족주의, those are all things that have to kind of be reevaluated over time. That's not going to be an easy conversation, but that is something that they will have to. The trend, I would say, in U.S.-Korea relations suggests, I think many people hoped that with the rise of Donald Trump in 2016, that maybe that would be something that would come and go. And over time, there would be a return to older ideas about what the U.S.-Korea alliance was. But now we know that that's not the case. It's going to be with us for the time being. And in the future, Korea is probably going to have to start to think about what it means to be self-reliant as an economy. And that might mean diversification of its trading partners, looking elsewhere for where it gets its goods and services and where it exports, but it also might mean taking on more responsibility for its own security. There are a lot of things to consider potentially, including wartime operational control. There's even the possibility of domestic, nuclear weapons development and use, but those are all questions. Those are all things that come with their own downsides, so they cannot be entered into with complete trust. They have to be thought out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I've heard people say that the time for a universal basic income was yesterday. So thinking about how we are going to take care of those who are going to suddenly have their jobs made redundant is something, I think that's what that's what Milton Friedman would have done. And I think to an extent other people, including Friedrich Hayek, would have said there have to be measures in place to meet the general welfare, even if we're not fans of central planning and nanny states, essentially. So something has to be done for them. So exploring how we are going to meet the needs of people who are going to be replaced by AI, that is something that has to be considered. But at the same time, we also need to, I think, be honest with the managers and the executives, the decision makers who are becoming increasingly reliant on AI. You know, you and I have talked about AI images and the emergence of AI images, and something that I think we're seeing now, okay, obviously people are sometimes fooled by the creation of AI images. Okay, there are so many of them going around. But one of the more recent phenomenons is the decline in the appearance of AI images. You know why that is? AI images build on what's already there. What's already there is other AI images. So basically we're seeing the watering down of AI. Okay, so people need to be real. They need to understand what an over-reliance on artificial intelligence is going to mean. And that is going to mean that we have to tell the people who are becoming increasingly reliant on it, if you cut costs by cutting staff, if you cut costs by getting rid of people, okay, there are going to be downsides. Mm-hmm. And policymakers in general need to be aware of that, and they also need to be aware of what will happen if the unemployment rate explodes. I think the view of tariffs, we all understand that tariffs are going to result in higher prices for us. Okay, we all know that that's going to be the case, and the words of various figures in this administration or otherwise to say that somehow tariffs are going to lower prices, we all know that that's not the case. That's just an attempt by politicians to spin things. That said, if we are looking at, say, tariffs on or other kinds of restrictions on automakers from a power that has used that influence to hurt people in the past, and so the United States, South Korea, the Philippines, many other places have found themselves at the receiving end of Chinese coercive power, and you know there are certain steps that can be taken to wean countries off of that reliance. Those are all things that should be considered, and so. Yeah, are tariffs the answer? I don't agree with the president. I don't see them as the broad multi-purpose tool that he does, especially when used against America's traditional partners, Canada, Mexico, and Europe, and so on. But we do need to think about what long-term reliance on Chinese goods, and especially high technology, could potentially mean for us. What kind of position would we be in if, say, 10, 15 years ago, Europe had really taken a long, hard look at its reliance on Russian gas? We might be in a very different environment right now. So navigating this, free trade remains an ideal, but we have to consider when we are dealing with countries that don't recognize the separation between business and government, that that's something that could be used against us. So, as I mentioned, I was just in India in February, and over there is a very broad skepticism toward USAID, toward the NED, and many other institutions, which they see as being there to undermine their government. They see that as a desire to turn out support for the opposition. These are all things that are regularly brought up, and nearly anybody can point to specific USAID programs and say this was a waste of money, this was a waste of public money, and they can turn to other programs along the way and say this was actually an interference in another country's affairs. And there may be instances where that is the case, but the complete downsizing of the NED, of not only them, but USAID, these attempts to rein in the U.S. Institute of Peace, the International Republican Institute, and so on, Yes, they're going to leave a lot of the support that North Korean defector organizations have relied on for many years, and I don't think that is something that can simply be replaced overnight. You know, even as marvelous as free markets are, they cannot simply replace that in a day. And so this was misguided, in my view. Cutting off the support for human rights organizations was misguided, and I regret that it has taken place in this way. That said, it might tell us a lot about this administration and what its directions are going to be going forward. Conservatives in the United States have been critical of NED, and they've been critical of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor out of the State Department because they may appreciate it undermining U.S. adversaries, they also see it as working toward values that are contrary to their own. And it also might suggest this is something that the Trump administration might use as a sign of goodwill if it approaches, Kim Jong-un later on, Kim Jong-un's regime later on with a potential deal. That is something that the president and certain members of his administration have been telegraphing by saying that they are a nuclear power and that they want to prevent an inadvertent conflict with North Korea in the future. So I expect the Trump administration to make an outreach to North Korea at some point. Well, on a case-by-case basis, I guess I would need a catalog of information about how individual institutions function. But yes, that is possible. Some of them may have expanded beyond their natural life. So that's possible, certainly. I guess my concern is really the suddenness of it and what it's going to mean to the overall body of knowledge and body of work being done for North Korean defectors. So that is something I think we'd have to see what the results are. Are North Koreans actually going to lose support, or were these just titles? Were they just titles that were there for the benefit of the director of a particular nonprofit, but that weren't necessarily serving? When the evidence is in, I think we can assess. Across Asia, I have been asked about the possibility of a second Trump administration on all of my foreign travels, whether I have been to India, to East Asia. Sometimes when I communicate with visitors in Honolulu, I often get asked questions about what a Trump administration would mean. And the assessments coming out of those countries really vary by country. For India, the assessment of Trump is largely positive. They do not see him as somebody who is going to promote democracy, potentially at the expense of their internal security. And many people over there see attempts to promote democracy as an attempt to promote the opposition party, as an attempt to favor the opposition party. So they don't feel particularly negatively disposed toward the new Trump administration. In many ways, many of them feel broadly supportive of it. Not all, of course, but many do. In the Philippines, I would say the assessment so far is they don't see a particularly big change either. And I think that is pretty true of the polling data across Southeast Asia and South Asia. In Southeast Asia and South Asia, ahead of the election in 2024, there was not a particularly strong preference for either candidate coming out of the U.S. And the Philippines, I would say, has very good reason to feel secure, more or less. They do not have the same kind of reputation that I think that the Trump administration has, or the same view that the Trump administration has for other allies, which is that they have taken from the U.S. and they have not given back. And broadly speaking, I think that the Marcos government and the Trump government will probably be pretty closely aligned. So their view, at least so far, seems to be that they are they don't expect a pretty dramatic change so far. Taiwan is interesting. There is some anxiety about the Trump administration coming out of Taiwan, and there are a few different reasons for that. One is the moving of TSMC basically promising to build more in the United States is something that is happening, and that has already been spun by sources who we think might be connected to China, as the U.S. is trying to basically deindustrialize Taiwan and trying to move its semiconductors out of Taiwan. That's not entirely accurate. They're just trying to diversify. That's all. And then there are other things, like President Trump has said in the past that he thinks that Taiwan needs to pay more for U.S. support and that they took all of our chips, things like that. Those are things that he believes, and the administration has thus far reinforced the idea of neutrality, that we will not commit to defending Taiwan in the event of a conflict. We are not going to say one way or the other, whereas President Biden said on multiple occasions that we would defend Taiwan. So there is an anxiety coming out of there, which is somewhat ironic because the first Trump administration really did more to elevate Taiwan's status than any administration, probably since Nixon. They are the administration that arranged a phone call between President Tsai and President Trump. They are the administration that encouraged more and more meetings between the two. And before the end of the first Trump administration, the outgoing Secretary of State basically lifted all restrictions on diplomatic contact between the two. So it's ironic, but that's the sentiment coming out of Taiwan at this time. Regarding the United States and North Korea, yeah, I share the assessment that dialogues between the U.S. and North Korea are probably on the horizon. The Trump administration, I think, as I mentioned before, has sent signals that is what they want, and they do not want to see a situation where the U.S. and North Korea are not communicating and that this leads to an inadvertent conflict. That's something that Secretary of State Rubio said during his confirmation hearings. So my impression is that is something they will push for. The question really is Kim Jong-un going to want to accept a meeting with Donald Trump? He certainly remembers 2019. He certainly remembers the meeting they had in Hanoi and the embarrassment that caused. So will he be willing to do that? He seems to be enjoying quite a bit the increased contact, the improved relations with Russia for the time being, who will not ask for anything like what the first Trump administration asked for, which is the complete denuclearization of his country. And there are questions, I would say, what would a deal between the U.S. and North Korea look like? What will the Trump administration ask for? What will Kim Jong-un be willing to give? Because when they met in 2019, there was a very big difference in terms of what they were willing to offer each other. Both of them seemed to arrive expecting the entire pot, and neither side was willing to budge. I think questions about the Trump administration's foreign policy in general are really something that we could probably revisit at the end of the year. Right now, the Trump administration is much more focused on domestic opponents, and there will be more of an effort to establish what its foreign policy really is, probably toward the end of the year. I think Marco Rubio, based on his background, has a very specific view of what foreign policy should look like. Someone like Director of Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard probably has a very different view of what that would look like. Donald Trump, I think, chose them because he saw them as people who were going to loyally carry out the vision that he has for the country. But what will that look like? It probably depends on which members of the cabinet he feels closest to. So, yeah, ask me again in 6 months.